I'll first start with saying a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today, which is, well, first I'll introduce a little bit more about myself and why I'm here and what I'm currently doing in Amsterdam. And then I'll basically go on a trip around the world with all of you. It's mostly Europe, to be honest, but we're gonna look at a lot of different examples and principles that are applied in different parts of the world in different times, and how we can use those principles, those tools currently in Amsterdam, and perhaps in the context that you're at. So I'd love to have some discussion about that. As mentioned, I think having some questions in between, especially if they're to clarify something or to ask a question about a specific topic that I'm touching on, I would be completely fine if there's some hands raised and we have some shorter questions. And if there's a question that I know that I'll touch upon later, I'll just mention that, and that'll also be good for me to know. Yeah, so we'll go through Amsterdam, and then in the end we'll have probably plenty of time to have a more broader discussion. So let's get into into it. This is that's a great play on words. As mentioned by Ryan, I started with international business, and I always like to introduce myself a little bit with the books that have inspired me most in this period of time. To have that on the screen as well. Maybe you recognize them, maybe not. So during my time studying international business, I sort of, figured out gradually that the type of economics and the type of business that we're being taught in schools is actually only a particular form and a particular doctrine, you might say, of economics, really excluding a lot of way more interesting versions of economics than the neoclassical story that we're familiar with. So the book, the New Human Rights Movement, really opened me up to that reality as well, and inspired me to do, well, stuff that is way more interesting than simply following the classic path of an economist or a business person, which made me want to change directions a little bit and go into urban environmental management. I spent half a year in Singapore studying and living there, which really inspired me. And because it's such a beautiful and green city, that in the Netherlands, of course, we're not doing a terrible job with our cities, but I just felt like we can do so much better in terms of the metabolism of the city, in terms of the green look and feel of it. And it's just so clearly nicer to live in an area that is more considerate of the environment, that is more green. So I wanted to dive a little bit more into that. And let's move on. I don't have to go too long into this. I worked for a little while with my brother on his own company, which is about emotional intelligence, and he created courses to teach both athletes, but also anyone basically, about emotional intelligence. And the idea was that we wanted to also implement that for companies that wanted to change to become more sustainable. You need some kind of emotional window and resilience to be able to handle maybe some structural changes. So that, but then COVID came, and I sort of had to change directions again, because our entire business plan we could throw in the bin after that hit. So then I went to the traineeship of the metropolitan area of Amsterdam, which is Amsterdam, but then with all the 32 surrounding smaller municipalities and 2 provinces that are included in that collaboration, basically. So I worked for a city, for a regional government, and then in the end for Amsterdam. And during my last period in Amsterdam, I studied specifically local currencies and their options in the context of the donut economy. I think I talked with Alex about that a little bit more. So luckily, I was able to present my findings after 7 months working for the city, basically proposing a way in which this concept could be introduced to really help the city in a specific way. And the aldermen or the people in the council were happy about it and hired me to start doing it. And that's where I'm at right now, trying to realize this. which is definitely an uphill struggle still, but we have in the key areas politically and in the bureaucracy, well, at least politically, we have support, which is because Amsterdam is probably one of the most progressive cities also in the Netherlands. Like the Green Left and Labour Party together are very dominant in the political arena there. And they are very excited, or at least interested in how this idea could play out. And you're probably familiar with Bernard Lietaer, given that you are all in this area of expertise, or in this academic niche, let's say, of well, the future of money and local money systems. So let's get into it a little bit more. I published these two papers. I'm not going to go into them right now. The first one was more about a specific effect in the circular economy, the Givon's paradox, it's also called, which is where I wrote my master thesis on. And the last one, markets and the future of the circular economy, also touches upon local money systems as an instrument for change. And this is going to be like the starting point of my PhD, which I just started this year. And the idea is, so this for the Dutch Research Institute of Transitions, which is a part of Erasmus in Rotterdam, the university there. And I want to investigate the transition potential, so placing it in the context of transition studies, transition science, or transition management as well. So from within an institutional environment, such as a local government, how to create these instruments or pathways towards like serious structural systemic change, instead of what local governments or governments in general seem to do quite often, just subsidize and throw money at problems incrementally or incidentally, instead of structurally changing dynamics in the local economy. And that's what we're trying to reach, and that's what I'm trying to research, in what way that actually works, or could work as well. So we're doing that in the context of community wealth building in Amsterdam. So community wealth building is a concept actually originating from the States. Ted Howard is the president and co-founder of sort of a think tank, which is called the Democracy Collaborative. Ted Howard is now in Amsterdam working with us, actually to implement this and to talk to a lot of the organizations we want to collaborate with. And this was a couple of weeks ago, where we, like with a lot of the organizations in that city area, we are, well, sort of committed to not necessarily using a local money system, but at least committed to being more transparent and working on a long-term plan together to sort of revitalize this district. Because New West is the district of Amsterdam that it has about 150,000 inhabitants. And if that district would be its own city in the Netherlands, then it would be the poorest city in the whole country. So there's a lot of well, economic despair at the moment, or at least maybe that sounds a little bit intense, but it's one of the economically challenged parts of the city. So there's a lot of attention to, well, make it better, to put simply. Moving on, I also would like to hear know a little bit more about who I'm talking to. Of course, I've met Ryan and Alex, but I'm wondering, are you all from the States, all from Oregon, I understand, or also from different parts? And perhaps if you have like your favorite example that you're already familiar with, and I can gauge a little bit how your knowledge about this is. Anyone? Or shall I just put someone on the spot?
I'm in Central Illinois, and I came into macro level monetary reform work through a critique of money and banking back in Amsterdam in the 1500s, but then via local currency. And so my route to macro level reform was through a conference in 2004 on local currencies in the 21st century that Lietaer spoke at and Margaret Kennedy spoke at, among many others. I'll stop there. I think most people, but not all, are from the US here.
Nice, thank you. Anyone else, or shall I?
I'm also seeing we've got Margot from Colorado, says they know very little. And Janice in Houston, Texas. So we're kind of calling from all over. And I know we have, well, I was going to say Hovert's calling from India, but he actually might be in the States now.
Sounds like a Dutch name, Overt.
Yes. And Luciano is joining too from Argentina. So we're kind of calling from all over the place.
All right. So we have some diversity in the crowd. That's good. I'll just move on and start our little journey across the world. But first, I'd like to shortly point out some of the sort of dynamics of how cities work nowadays. It's just very general, but it's sort of a starting point and also kind of a problem definition. That currently money flows out of cities, especially of suburb or like the peripheral areas of cities very quickly. We've seen that in the States a lot, but also in Europe, that you have this, what is sometimes called the London scenario, in which basically the center, the core of the city becomes very expensive and very crowded, and some of the outskirts just keep leaking money and get very economically behind, with of course all the social problems that are also well, consequences then. So that's one of the parts of the dynamics. And also local supply chains are very much weakened, of course, by the pandemic, by war in Europe, by globalization, meaning that a lot has been offshored and we're very dependent on these complicated international supply chains. So if something like an economic shock or anything happens, local areas are often way less resilient to deal with it themselves, because a lot of local supply has left the area because of a lack of local demand for such a long time. And that's this reinforcing spiral that we're trying to get out. At the same time, we know that interest and prices are rising because, well, for the last 2 years, definitely high inflation, interest rising, causing even more trouble and difficulties for smaller and medium enterprises and just individual entrepreneurs to start their local businesses and be connected in a local economy. So that's another important part of the dynamic. But then finally, maybe a more positive point in the dynamic is that innovation and like social, local, circular or sustainable initiatives, social entrepreneurs, they're really sprouting, especially in Amsterdam. And as far as I know, in a lot of places on the grassroots level, there's so much energy to be part of things that are potentially something that changes the economic system in a serious way. And I think there is a lot of energy to be harnessed there, and a lot of really good personal and collective action going on in different areas. And we're going to talk about a few of them. And just a very short sum up, we have in Amsterdam the Donut Coalition for the donut economics. We have the whole community wealth building group. We have Fearless Cities, which is similar in a lot of ways. Amsterdam Smart City, the Metropolitan Institute, green business clubs, green offices, all of these different concepts that have their own networks in the city, trying to well, basically move towards a more sustainable economy in general. So there's a lot of existing networks as well. And I'm sure that in a lot of cities, also in the US, these networks exist as well, although maybe they're not very well represented in the mainstream, which I think would be a goal in the end. So as we actually just heard, I think from Lucille, is that Amsterdam once upon a time had its own bank that worked for the local economy, which was around the 1500s. And also later when Amsterdam became like the center of trade in Western Europe, with all the harbor and also Rotterdam being pretty close. So we could actually use such a bank again, because a lot of the necessities are like slightly different, of course, because the situation is pretty different than it was back then. But we still need those functions. So for example, money, as I just said, leaking out of neighborhoods, procurement, consistently skips local suppliers because they base their choices on price and quality only, which often ends up being this prisoner's dilemma and having, in the end, procuring or giving the contracts to large multinationals or larger companies that don't provide any value back into the local economy, except for perhaps the staff that is there. And this is, well, decreasing purchasing power and really exacerbating this vicious cycle of declining diversity in local shops and supply in general. And then money, like the design of money, which we'll get into, is not really stimulating collaboration. It's really an instrument for competition because it's an end and it's not a means anymore. Whilst money, as I think most of us here would agree, is supposed to be a means to an end, and it's supposed to be like the lubricant of an economy, whilst in reality it's really become the end and the goal of a lot of the economic action or transactions that are taking place. So it follows the logic of financial markets rather than of community needs, and that is we can do something about that, which is what I'm going to talk about more. And then also I think I can touch upon this shortly because I have sort of assumed that you're also familiar with this, the way that money is created out of debt and then with interest asked upon it, you create this growth requirement because there's always more debt than there is money in circulation. Especially in a local level, if that dynamic is too strong, then you need to constantly grow. There's no room for a balanced economy on a local level as well. So therefore, we need some kind of interest-free circuit or credit to be able to facilitate a more balanced economy that doesn't always need to grow or be in a recession, basically. So there's different types of local currencies. This is quite an important part because actually, usually there is like a sort of an umbrella term, of course, the word local currency. For the project that we're doing in Amsterdam, I'm sort of really forbidden to talk about it as a local currency because we're not inventing another currency. What we're doing actually is taking normal euros and putting them into a network of local accounts. And by doing this, we're able to, well, sort of manipulate or at least stimulate some specific aspects that, well, we consider to be good for the community. So you have your time banks and barter networks, which are focused on exchanging time and objects. You're probably familiar with LED systems that are very prevalent in a lot of places. Hi there. Then we have vouchers or credits as rewards, so you can have like your classic loyalty or air miles or rewards for volunteers, like these kind of also types of local currency. And then I'm sort of skipping all the possibilities in the crypto world for now because that's not really what I'm going to talk about today. There's some blockchain applications also to be explored here, but that's not going to be a topic that I'm going to talk about today. Maybe if there are questions afterwards, we can dive into it a little bit, but I don't think it's necessary to talk about crypto when we're talking about very useful local money systems. Because what I'm mainly going to talk about is what we can call local conditioned money or circular money. To be honest, I'm still figuring out what the best term is, so maybe you can advise me on that later. Because I cannot call it an actual new currency, but yeah, conditioned is not a very positive or happy term to use. So I'm sort of doubting what is the best way to frame it. But the point is that it's normal euros, and but we're putting them into a network of local accounts. So you can imagine if you have your online banking, you have your savings, and you have your I don't know how exactly it works in America, but you have your savings account and you have your spending account, and then, for example, you could have an extra account, which is your local account. And there's different rules managing or governing that type of account. And so, for example, the software of the local account could tell me that I need to have this money in circulation for at least half a year or for at least a year before I can take it out of this system for free. Otherwise, you pay a small fee, and that fee will be, again, used for any community goal that the network decides upon. There's a couple other rules that I'll touch upon later when we go around the world for the examples. So we're gonna go to a bunch of different places. We're going to start in, I see I didn't translate it yet, but Old Sumer, going all the way back to the first documentation of different types of money existing at the same time. Then we're going to go to Wurgel, which is a small town in Austria. We're going to go to Preston, to Sardinia, to Santa Coloma, which is a smaller city near Barcelona in Spain, and to the Netherlands eventually, where there's a circuit of these small local money systems. So let's move to Sumer at the start of our trip. In ancient Sumer, there was this thing called barley money. And well, I'm again sort of assuming that you might be familiar with some of this story. But next to the money that was based on gold, at the same time, also you had this other type of money which was based on barley. Of course, the fundamental difference between money based on gold and money based on barley was that barley decays over time and gold doesn't. And this gives a very different dynamic to how money works and the bargaining positions of lenders and borrowers. So there's a very interesting case study basically to look at back in that time already. And that dynamic sort of went on to, or was actually adopted or, well, seen by the ancient Egyptians, and then the Romans came there to Egypt, and the Romans took that again to the time in which Jesus Christ was alive and the Bible was written. And of course, I think you're also quite familiar with the idea that in the Bible, as well as in Islam, interest is really, well, how do you say that? It's blasphemy in a way, because that you basically exploit money, and it's like rent seeking, and it's unearned income, or like all the different terms political economists try to describe it with. And the first thing that Jesus did at the height of his power was to kick out all the people who were lending money to the civilians with excessive interest, and therefore ruining the economy, increasing inequality, and well, clearly doing a bad job for the community. So this story again was a big inspiration for Silvio Gesell. I don't know if Silvio Gesell might be a little bit less of a famous name, but in this niche, he's I think a very important figure. Silvio Gesell was a political economist, and he wrote a lot about vrij geld, or free money, and vrij land, so free land. And the point of him is that these are the two most important areas of rent seeking, by which then again increase inequality and sort of ruin the local dynamics of an economy. And Silvio Gesell is when we move to the next location of our journey today, because he actually inspired with his work the mayor of this town called Wurgel. And that was mayor, I think he had the beautiful name of Unterguggenberger, beautiful German name or Austrian name. And this the Geldrevolution, or the money revolution of Wurgel, because they actually used and implemented a very innovative type of currency. Because what they did is, after World War I, there was hyperinflation, there was a lot of poverty in the area, and there was just not enough money going into this relatively small village. So the mayor, inspired by the work of Silvio Gesell, implemented a system that looked sort of that's the guy, very charismatic guy. So he implemented this sort of stamp system. And what it meant is that you can earn this money as a local inhabitant. The government would give jobs or like subsidies, or pay their civil servants with this money. And every month you need to put one extra stamp on the bill. And if you don't put the stamp on, the money loses its value, and the stamp costs, I think it was about 5%, or this small amount of the value of the bill. So it actually ensure, or it stimulated circulation. It was like it was like a hot potato you had to throw to the next person, so you don't have to actually pay this stamp, because that's, you know, you want to avoid that cost, and you can avoid the cost if you spend it quickly. So what happened is, on the first day that they issued this, it actually came, like, the same bill would come back to the government 5 times in the first day. It was an extremely successful idea. Like, roads were built, bridges were built, like suddenly everyone could basically go back to work, which is often the issue in an economic recession or depression. Everything is still standing, you know, the factories are still there, the people are still there, and suddenly no one can do anything. Weird situation. So in this particular example, this simple, relatively simple instrument completely changed the dynamic, and was a big success. So this stamp money actually saved the local economy at that time. And then it became so successful that it also became its own demise. Because in the end, other villages in the area were looking at this and they thought, well, this is actually a great idea. So a lot of other villages started to copy it and do a similar thing with varying degrees of success. And in the end, the central bank, of course, said, hey, you're not allowed to do this. And the central bank shut it down, as central banks usually do with innovative and radical new monetary design ideas. But the point was still it's like a sort of a founding myth of a lot of the current local money systems in Europe, or not myth as in it didn't happen, but myth as in shared story of origin. And also the mayor that really made the difference in a city like this. And one of the main lessons is that you can really stimulate money circulation in a local area with this avoidable fee, with this sort of demurrage or decay that you can design into the currency, which gives a sort of also a different philosophy to how money is used or is supposed to be used. Because in our current money, we are spending and saving the exact same currency. We're spending and saving the same entity of money. But by doing this and introducing this as a complementary monetary instrument, you can, like, this is really not meant to save. You're not meant to save up this money, like, not at all, which is very counterintuitive, because to many of us, saving money is a very good and positive thing, because we're thinking about the future. You know, we're saving up for a rainy day. It's a very positive and well, it makes a lot of sense to do that. So by separating these functions, you can actually still have that positive saving money in maybe your regular currency, but at the same time have another instrument that is really there to stimulate the economic activity. And it sort of balances out, because at some point, maybe you don't need any more economic activity. There's, like, everyone is working and everyone's doing well, then it's fine. And then you can start using the other currency again. So it's really a counterweight to this single currency that is maybe a little bit too, well, single-minded in a certain way. So that's interesting, an interesting lesson from Austria. And then we go actually into more modern times. Preston. So in Preston, in 2012, this is still in Dutch, sorry about that. In 2012, the government started with a community wealth building program there. And Preston was one of the beacons of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, and like a lot of industry there. And of course, as in many of these places, all of it left in these times, in recent times. All of the production facilities were either offshored or shut down, and local spending. And it was really one of the worst cities in all of the UK in terms of poverty and social problems and addiction and those kinds of issues. And when they analyzed the local expenditures of the government and a few anchor organizations, like locally embedded semi-public institutions, and only 5% of the whole budget was actually spent locally, and that means the city. And then 39% was spent in Lancashire County, which was the regional area. After implementing this community wealth building, within 4 years, you can see the difference going from 5% to 18% locally, and from 39% to almost 80% in the region, which resulted in interesting headlines. by, for example, The Guardian, and because actually this was like rock bottom, always the lowest in all the lists, all the news coverage, and now it's continuously being hailed as the most improved city in the UK, with like very impressive results, and actually this becoming a model for other cities in the UK and in Scotland as well, to and well, now actually in Amsterdam as well, to emulate this type of approach and the community wealth building approach. So I'll get a little bit more into what the 5 main pillars of community wealth building are. But one of the main lessons here is also that the municipality as an institution really cooperates closely with these local anchors. And it's really important that you form this strong block, or this strong collaboration between these important local institutions, that they dedicate themselves in a certain way to make sure that money circulates locally or is spent locally, to the degree that that makes sense, of course, because not everything is necessarily local, or not everything can be produced locally, of course, in this modern world. But just to get into the 5 pillars, very important: progressive procurement. Progressive meaning in this case mostly local and just considerate of social impact and of environmental impact, with these local anchor institutes. Local money circulation, so even after you spend the money, you try to make sure that those companies again also spend it locally. Inclusive democratic organizations, meaning different types of organizations like cooperatives, worker-owned enterprises, producer or consumer cooperatives, energy cooperatives, these kind of organizations that help the distribution of profits and change ownership. So that's the one on the right bottom: just use of land and property, because right now a lot of land and property in especially the economically challenged areas are not in the hands of the people that live there. I think it's a familiar dynamic that also happens a lot in the US. And simple examples such as a parking garage, or a house, or something that used to be a neighborhood cafe and now maybe they went bankrupt, it usually doesn't go into the hands of the community. And there are mechanisms that you can put in place that sort of ensure that these types of properties and property and land will end up in the hands of community control to a certain degree. And then meaningful and fair work as an important pillar as well, not like sort of along the lines of that not every job is a worthy job, or at least maybe that's not the right way to put it, but maybe let's say just a job is not enough, and knowing that very often you need 2 or 3 jobs to actually get by, to have a living wage, and that's not going to help anyone, or at least I think in this context we aspire to be more than that. So that's what we can learn in Preston, and then we're quickly moving on to Sardinia. Sardinia is an island which is close to Italy, part of Italy, which of course gives it a very interesting dynamic because it is an island and it has its own history. So it has stronger social ties and solidarity just by default, basically. And the example from Sardinia is Sardex Net. The name actually already implies what the initial goal was. Just like Brexit, Sardex, they wanted to leave Italy. They wanted to become sort of independent. The network was set up after the crisis of 2008, and they wanted to become more independent from the central government in Rome, more independent from the European Central Bank, and from the financial institutions that were taking over a lot of the economy there. So what they did is they created this network, this sort of credit union, and all of the money in that network was created within it without interest. So there's no, so it's fully like a mutual credit system that I think you're also quite familiar with. And it actually was an answer to a lot of this financial instability. It helped a lot of small entrepreneurs. It helped sort of financialize solidarity in a way, and of course increased a lot of resilience and a lot of the excess production capacity, in the same way that we saw in the example of Austria. Very often you have then a lot of capacity just unused, and having this type of local credit, which is a lot has a lower threshold and doesn't include interest payments, really can increase the using of the capacity that is available locally. So the interest-free credit is a very interesting feature of what such a local system can provide, because it's counter-cyclical, as in it resembles the Weer in Switzerland, which is a pretty well-known example, and that's also only being used if the economy is not doing very well. So if the economy, the general economy is not doing well, then the Weer is being used more. And the same goes basically for this type of credit. It's when the normal economy is not doing very well, interest rates are high, then this type of credit can become way more popular for people and small businesses to use. If the economy is doing great, then maybe we don't need a lot of interest-free credit because interest rates maybe are naturally quite low, and it's not really necessary. So again, it's a balancing counterweight. It's not necessarily a revolutionary, we're going to take over the normal money system, but by introducing this complementary dynamic, you can really change a lot of the excesses of the mainstream system, let's say. Let's see, and then an important part that I wanted to highlight here is also the impact of large networks, because this network grew from 2009 until, well, now it has almost 500 million euros in circulation every year. And the results are really impressive in terms of the extra revenue for the individual companies that are that have joined. And again, it was so popular, and this is actually a little bit again a risk that it's spread, and the national government in Italy has taken over, which is always a threat in a certain way. And to me, working for a local government, a big lesson, or at least something to really keep an eye on if you're developing such a thing also within an institutional context. And not that it's a bad thing that it's spreading, because a lot of the same possibilities it still enables, but it has also lost some of its core ideology. It's because now there's a lot of big investors that have come in, and they need to get a return on their investment. And this basically means you have an extra extractive force on this network. And the whole point, I believe, of these types of networks is that they work exclusively for the community, and they prevent, or at least drastically minimize the level of extraction, monetary, financial extraction from this network. And that is at least slightly in danger now. But the same mechanism of interest-free credit is now available on a very wide scale. So maybe that's an interesting point of debate. I'm not fully convinced of that it's a very great idea, but I'm also not convinced that it's, well, the end of the world for this, or like the end of the line for this initiative, because it's still one of the most inspiring and definitely the most successful in terms of scale in Europe and probably in the world right now. So again, this power of large networks and being able to visualize that, I've found that it's really useful, and it's really can be quite inspiring for people to see this growth and how that can really make a very big difference in a relatively short amount of time. So this is the network of the Utrecht Euro, which is where I live and I've volunteered for. And it's really relatively small. So as you can see, it's not a very impressive network yet. There's no governments involved. There is no large local institutions involved. It's really a network of about 160 entrepreneurs and about the same amount of individuals that use it to buy. Well, I use it mostly to buy beer and coffee, but still nice. But it's small scale. But then we have the Circuit Nederland, and this is the combination of all the local networks in the Netherlands. And you're already getting to a size which is a little bit more like, okay, this now we're getting somewhere. So we have networks in Alkmaar, in well, I can name a bunch of places which probably won't mean anything, but there are a bunch of small networks that are independent, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the interesting features of having this network and visualizing it is that you can also start analyzing the network in a more scientific way. So there was a paper published in Nature about this system, or about actually the network of Sardex, of the Sardinian network, which use the same tool that I've used here to visualize the Dutch network. And what it can do is it can identify the most effective points in the network or in the system to intervene or to help out, to increase basically the circularity of monetary flows. So, and sort of the assumption is there then that also increases the circularity of materials or resources. And this can be very useful, of course. I'm seeing a question, maybe that you can ask it now, John. You're muted still. Wait a second.
Okay, now, I'm really interested in this, and maybe you're going to get to this anyway, but I'm interested in how the networks work. How do you in one community essentially use your money to be in, if you travel to another community or want to buy something from another community? How do those interact?
Good question. I will get to that. I will get to that in a second, but it's definitely a good question. Yes. Maybe Howard, now that you have a question as well.
Well, I was just wondering if you had thought about, or because you didn't include it when you talked about the barley currency, which was a kind of a form of a demurrage currency because the material rots, and how that generated prosperity amongst those people, like it did in Wurgel, where $2.5 million worth of public works were accomplished in 15 months. It was pretty impressive. Yeah. And of course, the reason it was shut down was the, those central banks and the power of whoever knows up there that is in charge of things, apparently, and make wars, etc., without much opposition. And so I was wondering, did you ever consider the dynamics of net present value in this, and how it affects the psychology of thinking long term, which I think is really an important thing for society today to start doing?
Yeah, definitely. That's, and I didn't go very deeply into it now, also because of time, but that's one of the main reasons that this is important, but also the dynamics between the sort of the bargaining position of the lender and the borrower. And I sort of left it at that, but it really, because basically, like, how I understand it as well is that as a bank, if you have this money, you need to do something with it within a year or less, and that just really weakens your bargaining positions, or it strengthens the position of the lender, the borrower.
It does eliminate the power aspect of money, where accumulations can dominate a market.
Exactly.
I thought was really good.
Anyway. Yeah, I think there's way lengthier and in-depth analysis of this. But yeah, thanks a lot. That's maybe good to clear up a little bit.
All right, thanks.
All right, shall I continue, and then I'll get to the question of John probably in the next slides. After this, I'll get to how the Dutch network works in more detail. But first, we're going to go to Santa Coloma. Santa Coloma is like the sort of peripheral city of Barcelona. So it has this big international hub right next to it, which, of course, you can already imagine the type of economic dynamics that are taking place in a city like that. Similar in size to the district of Amsterdam New West, that has about 150,000 inhabitants. So it's not very small, but it's not a huge metropole. And they've applied a similar system in an interesting way as well. They've been going at it for about 10 years now. And it's called Gramanet. So Gramanet de Santa Coloma. And it's specifically the reason that they implemented it here was that they've noticed, as the local government, they give a lot of subsidies and they give a lot of business grants for whatever types of businesses that they want to stimulate, as local governments do. But they tested and they did some research, and they figured out that all of the subsidies or the money that they gave to their local businesses, more than 80% of that money was gone out of the city after one purchase, after like one more change of hands of the money. So they basically felt like they were throwing money into like an endless pit, or like just instantly almost everything left the city. So it was very like sort of ineffective way of subsidizing. So they wanted to increase the local multiplier effect, basically. And this is also the tool that is interesting to discuss related to this example. So they wanted to use this to have more effective subsidizing. So basically by now, because now the network has grown enough, it's actually a rule that as a local business in Santa Coloma, you can only get subsidies from the government through this network. So when you want to get money from the government, you have to at least make sure, and there's some nuance there, I'm not exactly sure in the details, but you have to spend it again locally. And there might be some exceptions here and there, but that's maybe not the most important right now. But it was about amplifying the impact of public money, because right now, very often this money just flows out. And so in this way, it was really ensured to recirculate locally, also after the government spent their money. So even to the degree that now, at least that's what the person in charge there told me when I was speaking with him, that if you're at a local terrace or at a shop, and like 10 years ago, they would ask, do you want to pay cash or credit? And now they would ask, do you want to pay cash or gramanet? This is like, it's really normalized. And for a lot of people in this area and a lot of companies that trade and use this currency amongst each other. And it's actually built on the same software that the Dutch network is, and also the same software as the Sardinian network is, which I'll tell a little bit more about. So it's also so this LM3 method. I don't know if that's a familiar term. I'm not seeing a lot of sort of. So the LM3 method, the local multiplier 3 method, has been developed by the Center for Local Economic Strategies, which is based in the UK. And it's a method that gives a sort of a quantification of the local impact of an expenditure. So how that works, it's actually, it's quite simple. Like the problem with calculating these type of things is usually that it gets very complicated and convoluted. And for regular small local governments, this is not something that they aspire to do. So they wanted to create a really simple, low threshold method to still quantify and have some data on the local impact of their expenditures. So it works as follows. You have round one, you determine the income of a certain group or organization. You go to round two, how much of that money is spent locally, pretty simple. And round three, of that money spent locally, you interview those businesses and figure out how big the proportion of their expenditures are locally. And then quite simply, you get a number, a ratio, which in this example, if you look on the left hand, so if you have an example, there's an organization spending 10,000 euros, 5,000 of which is spent locally on staff and local goods and services, and 5,000 it's maybe spent on rent or whatever, and it goes out of the local area. Then you contact those companies where you spend your money locally, and usually these are local ties, local relations. So hopefully they'll collaborate with the research for the good of the community. That's sort of the idea, because we're talking about transparency of financial transactions as well, which for some is not a very easy topic. But then you check out the local recirculation, and you can really simply, this is like primary school math that anyone can do in any area, and you get this ratio, and it's always between 1 and 3. Because that's how the math works. And you can basically, well, the idea is that you could put this as a metric for example, if in public local procurement. So you say we have this contract, or we have this money that we're going to use for a certain assignment as a local government. And we want to make sure that we only want to give this contract to companies who have an LM3 score of above 1.5, or pick your ambition, and this is a very simple way that you can have this type of quantification, because right now in Europe, especially in EU law, and I'm not sure, of course, how that works in the US, but You cannot discriminate on the market. There are really strong rules that basically favor large corporations that can produce cheaply, but local procurement is not really an explicit metric to consider in this whole process. So this could add that element in a very quantifiable way and a very simple way for small organizations for themselves to calculate their LM3 score and actually being able to market and promote themselves. But, hey, look, we have this score of maybe 2.2, which is probably the highest of the area. So if you spend money at our business or organization, it will mean that in this case 1.7, it means that 70 cents extra will be earned by the community. And the higher the score, of course, the higher the extra impact. And it's LM3 and not 4 or 5, because then it gets really difficult to actually trace. And the 3 is kind of a nice average to take. You could also do an LM2 score, which is, it says a little bit less about what you're doing, but could also be a lot easier. It's definitely a lot easier to calculate that. So it's kind of a versatile, nice, simple tool that basically any local government or shop can use to either promote themselves or set more benchmarks on local impact, which is what they did in Santa Coloma. They used this method, and by doing that, they concluded that we can really raise this score for all of our companies and really achieve a lot more local economic impact. So that's the lesson from Santa Coloma. Now we get to the Netherlands, the final destination of our journey today. So I should start probably with, because I talked a little bit about there's different small independent networks, community managed payment system, and on the left you see Cyclos. Cyclos is the software that it uses. It's the same software that is used by Sardex and by Santa Coloma, and about 15 million other end users are currently using the software. It was developed by STRO, the social trade organization in the Netherlands, and how they manage it is that, so the STRO is a non-profit, but Cyclos is a business that can sort of sell the license to use this software to both commercial entities and to local non-profit networks. So if you are a commercial bank, and they have a lot of commercial banks as their clients, also in Africa, in South America, then you have to pay a license fee. And with this fee, this income that that Cyclos generates, STRO is partly or mainly financed, and they are able to offer this software for free to anyone who would want to set up a local currency network or a local payment system. So that's why it's very easy. I talked to most of the initiatives, the people that started it there in the Netherlands, and I asked them, so how is it difficult to set this up? And they said, well, basically give a call, say where you're from, and tomorrow you can start using the system. And it's been it's safe, like it has a lot of end users, and they have 20 years of experience of creating and managing it. So it's a very low threshold way to start these kind of grassroots local systems, and they're independent, like you can set them up by yourself, but they're also connected because they are in the same software. So this again gives potentially a lot of possibilities. Right now, because the networks are really small and quite dispersed, there's no dynamic between them yet, but we're thinking about developing sort of because there's one that's called United Economy, which is sort of the non-local version of this network. So there's of course larger companies that maybe do not have a very local presence, but they are very valuable in terms of part of local supply chains, or they are very committed to being circular or sustainable, and therefore it can operate as sort of a central hub. So if in your local area you're using your local system, but you cannot spend it locally, you can look at this network, this national network, where maybe you can find somewhere or someone to spend your local currency at. And then it gets complicated, because it could just, as it is now, every local euro it's always €1. The value is pegged to the euro. But you could start playing around with exchange rates between the local networks, depending on where you want to stimulate that trade or economic activity goes towards. The same dynamic you can also have, for example, in the City of Amsterdam. Right now we're setting it up in the West, but eventually we want to grow towards the southeast and the north, which is also economically a little bit behind, and hopefully in the end that you can use it in the whole city. But you don't want to get back to the same dynamic of the city as it is already. So then again, you can have these sort of tiny or small exchange rates, there's different possibilities, and this we're figuring this out right now, and it's going to take quite a long time before we get to that stage. But there are all these possibilities because they're housed in the same quite flexible software. And again, to also answer, I think, your question, John, how it works. So I've been working with the Utrechtse euro, or like using it for the last almost 3 years now. And what I did is I had like a periodic transfer that every month I would send 50 euros to the bank account that is the backup for the whole system. So there's a 100% backing of real euros in a bank account that is sort of behind lock, like sort of locked up, not being invested in risky assets or something like that. So if everyone at the same time would want to take out their local money and trade it back to normal euros, they would, and there would not be like a bank run panic as would happen if we do that with our normal money. So there's the 100% backing, and this creates the possibility for them to credit your account and know for sure that the money in the collective accounts in the local system never exceeds the money in the backup or in the bank account. Within that, of course, if you start to play around with the interest-free credit and the possibility to create money in this local system, then you're going to have to deal with risk funds and other ways to guarantee that this dynamic will not be problematic. And there's one more thing maybe that is interesting to mention about the credit, also because that was also possible in these networks, the local credit, is that the philosophy behind it is that it's interest-free, but of course, borrowing money still costs money. There's still costs associated to that. So you cannot simply make that free because you need a risk assessment, especially if you're talking about some bigger amounts. And there's generally a price of to make this happen. But the philosophy behind it is that unlike with normal money, and if you take credit from a bank, you're assumed that you are the only one, or you're the one that profits from getting this credit, and therefore you're the only one that's going to pay for it. But in this system, as a community, you know for sure that if I take out a loan for 50,000 euros inside the system, then this money will circulate amongst all of us, and we will all profit from the money that sort of I created because I took out this loan. So there will be costs that are single, like a single time. There will be some costs to pay for risk assessment, to pay for the organizational administrative side of it, and then the remaining costs of what usually be the interest where profit is created will now simply be divided over the whole community, because we're all profiting from this new money that is introduced into our system. So that's sort of the philosophy. And again, there's quite some nuance and detail on how to really realize that. And we might get into it, because I feel like that maybe you even know more about this than I do. But we're gonna move on for now, because I'm also looking at the time. I think we're still good, but and we're just checking, John, did that sort of answer your question a little bit? You can just.
Yeah, it seems to me that you know, for those of us who see the need for essentially a national or global change, and we ask ourselves, well, what's the vehicle by which you could get there through this monetary, the kind of local currencies you're talking about? And so, you know, there's always been a push historically for uniform currencies, so you don't have to deal with exchange rates and so on. That's been a big push. And so that's the thing to overcome, essentially, when you talk about starting from local currencies and then coming together to essentially establish the kind of change that has an impact on where a nation's resources go. Because right now, even with, you know, lots of public banks or or local banks, it's still the big banks that are controlling the bulk of where new money from any country goes every year.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
Yeah, thanks for that, because that's exactly also one of the arguments or the reasons that we are starting these kind of local networks, and we sort of reintroduce the function of the exchange rate. As in Europe, we had a lot of different currencies just over 20 years ago. And these exchange rates, they have a function because they sort of regulate the dynamics of international trade and the value of these currencies. And now it was just all flatted basically, because now in the south of Greece, they're using the same currency as in Finland. That's a completely different type of country and culture and type of economic type of economy. Sorry, and by having these different local networks and being able to reintroduce functional exchange rates, which are not problematic because of the complexity, because now that's all digitalized, and you don't even notice the fact that you have this exchange rate, because it's way easier with the current technology to manage that. And of course, in the last century, when we had all these exchange rates, it was just a huge cost. It was a huge issue and a nuisance for all the exchange offices. That's no longer necessary. It's digital. It's instant, real-time feedback. So bringing back that function is possible without bringing back all of the problems that it used to be associated with. And that's one of the reasons that this can also be very functional if you diffuse these type of local systems on a larger scale. Like I can imagine at some point that a lot of regions, they have these type of regional currencies which sort of can act as this exchange rate or counterweight to bring a better balance or a just in general a better economic dynamic to the areas. So I hope that, yeah, thanks for that comment, because I forgot to mention this.
Thanks.
All right, moving on. So we've sort of concluded our little trip around the world. Oh, I see that I forgot to translate this slide. I'm sorry. But basically, so yeah, we've seen the barley money, the gold money. So the fact that two can exist at the same time, and it influences the power dynamics. A local money circulation in times of recession in Borgel, that it's going to have great economic effects, and of course all the social and environmental spillovers. Effective subsidizing in Spain. We've seen interest-free credit and solidarity in Italy, a community wealth building in the UK, and grassroots networks in the Netherlands. So those are the main examples that we're all incorporating right now and taking into account in Amsterdam. But just to again sort of zoom in into one of the conclusions here is that the design of the payment system, as you know, strongly influences the behavior of money and the dynamics of the power of such a society, and the degree of inequality and the degree of the structures that either exacerbate or alleviate this type of inequality. And you have these different types of accounts that we're currently all using and familiar with, such as regular debit or credit account, which is basically designed for individual freedom and to spend wherever you can in the whole country or world, or a deposit account, or a savings account, I should say here actually, which gives the bank free control over what they do with your money and invest in whatever they like. And you have now Bitcoin crypto accounts, which draws money away from the government's view or from transparency and builds or sort of programs this trust into the system. Again, that we could talk about that for probably hours, but I will try to skip it a little bit. But because the point is, why not have an account that is designed and focused on the needs of a community? And this makes maybe even more sense in smaller communities that are actually secluded a little bit, but also in areas of cities that are left behind, as we see in a lot of the big cities of our modern time. And there is, as we've seen, there is a type of account that could do that could do this in this software that I've spoken about. But I'm sure other softwares and other designs, other variations on these ideas are possible. But to sort of have this idea of money that's really spent and respent in the local economy, and if you have plenty of volume there, and I'll get to that, it offers so many possibilities in terms of the creation of credit, in terms of financing other local neighborhood projects, or supporting local entrepreneurs, or anything that your community values, because the network is able to generate value or money or revenue within itself. So just to reiterate, I think some of the things, we call it conditioned or circular money, but again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that if you have a better term. It keeps circulating in the city, so money that is invested in the circular economy or in the local economy stays within that network and generates more positive impact. It incentivizes sustainable choices because local supply and demand can find each other more easily, lowering transportation, lowering import, lowering traffic. It connects local and sustainable businesses, circular development, and all kinds of social initiatives as like a financial backbone. Like it's both a commercial, social, and financial network that together can really offer a counterweight to this increasing presence of multinationals and increasing social cohesion in areas. Again, increasing resilience, just because it strengthens local supply chains and hopefully reintroduces all types of local supply that has disappeared from areas, which actually is very useful to have a resilient local economy, which then again shields the local economy against speculation, against economic shocks of whatever kind. And finally, so it's interest-free, which helps the sort of eliminate this growth requirement at least on a local level. It's transparent. It could be managed by a cooperative, managed by people from the community. So again, that sort of summarizes the aspects of this type of money that I'm talking about today and that we're trying to implement in Amsterdam. Some essential ingredients. That's very important that you have these elements to a system if you want to start something like this. What we've learned from the different initiatives as well and from the literature is that you need scale and volume, because a lot of local networks, they are very nice and friendly and just small scaled. And what happens in those situations very often is what we've seen is that it doesn't change anything in the economic dynamic. It basically houses transactions between local businesses that are already taking place in a different system and doesn't really change the preference or larger order incentives. And that is simply a big issue. Like, it can still be valuable and increase social cohesion, but it's not going to change economic dynamics on a serious level. And that's why you shouldn't take or you shouldn't be satisfied, let's say, with like being a small pilot in a small area of a small place, because that so often has been the case. Like, oh yeah, we're going to do a small pilot with this local currency, and then they conclude, yeah, it's not effective. It's like, yeah, sure it isn't, because it's a super small pilot. So that's like some classic trap that has happened so often, and very often it doesn't only not work, but it ruins the possibility of it ever working. Because then in the future, if you want to try it again, they'll look back and say, yeah, we tried this, it didn't work. So it's a very big risk if this happens. So that's also was one of the terms of my employment. That if they're going to cut my budget, if they're going to decrease the scale on which we want to do this, then I'm not going to do it. I said, like, because then I'm set up to fail, so I'm not going to continue if this is the case. Very important. Then the participation of anchor organizations is vital, I think, related, of course, to the scale, but also to the legitimacy, to the influx of a substantial amount of money that these local organizations that have a stake in creating a good local environment, that they're willing to accept it, that they're willing to join and use this, well, what I shouldn't call currency, but this system. That's also an important part. And so this is what we've seen, maybe just shortly, because I didn't mention the example of Cleveland, Ohio, which you might be familiar with, which is where community wealth building was applied on quite a big scale, and with these anchor organizations like big universities, hospitals, and they didn't use a local money system, but they again had tremendous results in terms of creating worker-owned cooperatives, redirecting money from these large institutions into the local economy, where previously they were financing big multinationals. Now they were financing, or at least supporting, local cooperatives, mainly existing of people that were formerly incarcerated or formerly addicted or had issues of any kind, And now they are, for example, they have a huge industrial laundry facility now that washes all the sheets of the hotels and the hospitals in Cleveland. That's one very inspiring example, I think. Then, of course, political support, because this might be an area for debate as well, because to institutionalize or not to institutionalize is, of course, the question if you're dealing with systems change. In the end, you would want to reach the mainstream, I would say. And that's why I'm choosing this path of institutions. And I'm, in Amsterdam, sort of lucky that the parties in charge of the city, they're at least friendly to the idea and want to explore it. But in practical sense, it makes life a lot easier if you have political support, if you have a budget from a local government. But it also brings along risks, the risks that national governments take over, that your core ideas are diluted. So there's a lot of things to take into account in this area. And finally, of course, quite simply put, you need strong communication, good digital infrastructure. Like those are, of course, sort of parameters, or how do you say, conditions that just need to be right. Otherwise, you're going to have very practical issues. I think, oh yeah, this I can just quickly look at. This is how the app, the Cycles app actually looks and works on my phone. So this is my account, and you have like your account, and you can see where all the shops are that you can use it at. You can pay with a QR code or just send it to a company. And you have like ads. The local businesses can also put their ads in the app. And well, I have to say, it looks like it's an app from like 2011, and we're working on some updates, but functionally it's all there. It's really not that hard to use, but we can definitely still make some steps to eliminate all the well, let's say hassle that people will experience from using another payment form. We can definitely make that a little bit easier. And this is my final slide. So who benefits? Of course, it's not, I've sort of touched upon a lot of this already, so I won't go into a lot of details, but small businesses and entrepreneurs, they can benefit greatly, have more revenue, more access to finance or credit, social and commercial network. Inhabitants can structurally support actually a transition to a stronger local economy. They have more jobs. They should have more meaningful jobs in the area as well, not just any job. The city or the city government will have a concrete instrument, and again, stressing that the city or the government should not be the sole authority on what to do with this network. That can be managed in different ways. But at least they can have different options of stimulating money flows and credit in the area to help them reach all kinds of social, environmental, and economic goals. And finally, society in general is better equipped against economic downturn and is supposedly, hopefully, more sustainable, resilient, and locally connected. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you a lot for your attention. This has been quite a story. If you have any questions or discussion, then this is the time. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question, if I can put in a question here, and that is, you said this, the whole system of these conditioned currency, or whatever, what you didn't use the term currency, but this system is backed up by a deposit in a bank. So what that means is that people who buy this currency are buying it with standard euros, and that money is then going in the bank.
Yes.
And that's the way it's backed up.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
And I see or understand that maybe it takes away a little bit of sort of the revolutionary aspect of it, but also in reality, also just legally in Europe, it's necessary to have this type of setup. Otherwise, you won't even get to a level of scale because you'll be, cut off by the authorities. So we need 100% backing in this way.
Yeah. That's the way the early credit union system worked in this country too. They would take money in that way and they'd put in a bank account. Then they'd lend that money out of the bank account. They weren't creating money as they lent. That's the way it worked.
I think a lot of people assume right now nowadays that that's how banks still work. But I think we know that that's not the case.
Right.
Any other questions, or maybe some suggestions on how to call this? I mean, even in English, but because of course, I'd like to use local currencies in my research because it's more of community currencies or complementary currencies. But maybe to have a little bit of backstory, because like why I'm really not even allowed right now anymore to say that it's a currency, because we applied for a subsidy from the European Union, and they have subsidized the social trade organization before in different projects, and they have this new program in which they want to sort of revitalize small local areas. So there's like a lot of money from Europe that's available, and we applied for the subsidy, and they interpreted or translated it as if we were going to create a currency, and they just simply said, well, that's not legal, so you're not going to get this money. So that there's a very strong legal implication if we're using the word currency, even though we're talking about euros. So like I'm being very mindful of the fact that every time I use the word currency, I'm saying we're not talking about a new currency. It's just about euros, and we're just limiting, or we're putting it in a different network of accounts. Ekaterina, hey, I think I've met you before, right? Or I'm sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Yes.
can hear you.
Okay. I have a question about like 5 pillars of community wealth. And then this one of the pillar you told that about the land and that the land should, that should own the local community or something like this. But what should we do like with the current situation that generally the land is owned by the landowner? So how we can like convince them like to, I don't know, to present this land to the communities or whatever?
So there's one interesting concept that is being used, I think also in the US. It's called community land trust, which is a way in which with the community together, you can together buy a piece of land, or through other mechanisms. For example, if there are senior citizens in an area that might retire, or if they pass away, that there is a mechanism that then gives that property or that land to the community, which then can be managed together. So there's a couple of different specific instruments in that area as well. I can send you maybe a link to the community wealth building program, or like the concept, and there are different ways to reach that on the website of the Democracy Collaborative. So that maybe, I think there's a bit more on that there. Does that answer your question a little bit? Because I can talk about community land trust a little bit more, but
yeah, but
it's
just
quite away from the local money systems.
Okay, thank you.
I think, did Howard have a question?
I guess it really wasn't a question, but I was thinking that backing, there was some concern about it being backed by the national currency, but that Wurgel currency was backed by the national currency too. And yet, because of that multiplier effect, it was able to accomplish a tremendous amount of work through the velocity without using a lot of money. Yeah,
exactly. So it's an interesting thing that if you, because I get this reaction quite often, like it's still euros. Isn't it still vulnerable or fragile in the same way that the euro is? But it's sort of, that's the entire point, to be able to actually influence the dynamics of how euros work in a local area without having to overthrow the whole system. You just sort of make it more malleable by introducing these local accounts, and you can add your rules and stimulations if you want into that small area, which will have it work for you instead of for the large financialization of the economy.
And even if the national currency just went away, why wouldn't that local currency continue to operate just fine?
Exactly, and that's something that it's slightly more cheeky to mention, but it's always nice to say, like, what if the euro crashes, and then like,
Yeah.
well, we can just continue using our local euro as if it didn't.
That's the point, isn't it?
But that feels kind
resiliency.
Yeah, it feels kind of like far-fetched or something, but and I'm not sure how that would play out in reality, but at least in that's also how I think about it. Like, even though it's backed up, so it has this sort of safety in this current institutional environment, but it's also, and that's why I like to call it a system bridge. We can build it up in the current system, and then it could sort of survive a movement towards a new or a different system, and that's why I think it has so much value as an instrument for this transition.
Yeah, very good.
Thanks, Lucille.
Yeah, so I guess the end of that conversation, I'd like to push that a little bit more. If you, I think you probably know, I assume you know, that this organization whose forum you're speaking at does work at the macro level of changing the national money system from a private interest-bearing credit or debt system to actually a full money system. And that would not preclude the possibility and the needs exist for there also being this kind of system that you're describing, a local, municipal, regional, county level system. At least in my mind, it doesn't preclude that. It might make it less necessary. And my question, I guess, is could you talk a bit more about your understanding of kind of what you said at the end there of to what extent is what you're working on enabling people to survive within the existing system better within communities and enabling that existing system itself to survive.
That's a good one.
And continue doing its damage and extractive work, or can you articulate and have you thought about, how your work feeds into, if at all, change at the macro level? So I don't know if you've worked on that, but I want to hear you talk a bit about it.
Good question, because especially in the context of my PhD, that's what we're investigating as well, because my promoter is a professor of transition studies, and he, for the last 10 or 20 years, has been developing this theory and really talking a lot about optimizing the current system versus really changing the current system. And very often there's a surprisingly thin line between those two. For example, if you talk about recycling, a lot of people think about recycling as a great thing, which is green, which in a way it is, but it also justifies bad design, and it locks bad design into the system. Just like energy to waste, or like a waste to energy plants, and these kind of things, they create a lock-in of the system instead of actually changing it. So this is a very interesting question if we relate it to the currency system, because in a way it doesn't, I think it does make the euro work better. So it does make a national currency way more tailored and viable and useful for a local area, which could be very much something that will entrench and help the euro survive. And so we need to dive deeper into how this risk can be overcome. And this is exactly what I'm writing about in the current paper that I'm hopefully publishing later this year. Because there are several mechanisms or several of these rules or possibilities of such local systems, especially if you sort of hypothesize that these local systems are present all over the country, to the actual structural dynamics of the economy and how that is influenced. So talking about property as the fundamental cornerstone of the market, talking about competition and how it influences dynamics of competition, about how value is valued, let's say, as in, for example, Mariana Mazzucato, so she writes a lot about how right now price is determining value, whilst we should move towards a system in which value determines price. And it's more of a value theory, and that's one of the sort of spectrums which I'm investigating here as well. And trying to take money away from it being a commodity itself, because money itself now is a commodity, whilst that brings about its own problems, as you might or probably know, because every, like, at least theoretically, every transaction with the current money influences the price of that same money, which is a very strange dynamic, and that's also what creates this this idea or this reality that money now is purely a means, or not, yeah, purely a means towards an end, or actually purely an end itself. And money itself, you sort of have money to make more money, and that's become one of the main functions, which has spiraled the whole financial system out of control in terms of how big it's become, as opposed to the normal real economy. So I believe that it can influence multiple of these dynamics, which are more fundamental to how the economy works and how markets work in general. But that doesn't, like, while saying this, I also feel like it doesn't completely take away that risk, because maybe if I'm painting a little bit of a darker scenario, then it's also possible that maybe European Central Bank will notice what we're doing, and they should say, well, if we do this, this actually might help us, keep the euro and also keep some of its destructive abilities in or aspects in the process, and whatever their intentions. And of course, central banks on big levels or on high levels are tricky, to say the least, to deal with. As Howard already alluded to, you never know exactly who on top of the chain is actually pulling the strings there. But I hope that sort of gives a better insight into this question, Lucille.
Mhm. Yeah, it helps. I could ask more, but we'll pass on to John here. Thank you.
Thanks.
So in terms of the competition between currencies, or how one supplements another one, it's interesting that the CBDC push is essentially represents a threat to bank money, in the sense it's an opportunity for people to put their money in the central bank rather than in commercial banks. So commercial banks feel threatened essentially by that kind of thing. But in the system that you're talking about, you've taken in the euros and you put it in a commercial bank. It's there while you're doing your thing with this sort of local system. So in a sense, as Lucille, it raises a question of what Lucille, it essentially uses the system that exists, and so they still have that money to do what they want to do with like banks always do, which is use the money in such a way as to concentrate wealth.
That's why we need to be very specific about which bank we choose to be this guardian of the backup money. And we prefer to work with Triodos, which is a bank in the Netherlands, which is supposed, or at least aspires to be, the most sustainable bank in the Netherlands, in Europe, and hopefully one day the world. So they are very strict about their investment processes and how and in what kind of companies they invest. And the idea, of course, is that this money doesn't get invested into any risky assets because it needs to be a backup. And this, of course, for a bank, you can imagine this is a very difficult image or mission to have. And they are actually a little bit in trouble every now and then, because, as a bank, you're not making a lot of profits if you're very focused on green investments. So, and you're really strict about that. And so that's, it's definitely an issue. But again, the reality of wanting to do this on a scale, on a legitimate scale, and sort of also legitimized by governments, which helps. In the end, it does help trust, even though for some people it might erode the trust if the government is sort of behind it or at least co-financing it. But those are all sort of tricky dynamics or spectrums to be aware of.
Yeah, I do appreciate the point that you made earlier about how with the information transformation in the digital age and handling things, then this business of exchange rates becomes minimized. So, I mean, that's one of the things that I've always thought of as something that stands in the way of this kind of local currency kind of a thing. But your point is well taken, that in fact, those kinds of issues, what with the information age, are handled more easily than they have been in the past.
Yeah, and I hope that will also, I mean, of course, in the details of that, it can still get complex, but I think, and if I talk to anyone who's in IT, they'll say there's an algorithm for everything, like these kind of issues that can relatively simply be solved with nowadays without a lot of extra costs or complexity. So yeah, thank you. Govert?
Before we jump into Hobart's question, do you mind if we take the screen share away so we can
yeah, sorry. Yeah.
see each other? Thank you. All right, Hobart, go for it.
Hello, Landsnoot. Hello, everybody.
Hey.
I'm from Amsterdam, so I love these kind of stories of its deep history and also its progressive agenda overall. Are you in contact or aware then of the Dutch monetary or sovereign monetary reform organization Ons Geld?
Yeah.
They're very known because they had this fantastic play.
The play as well, yeah.
Yeah, door de bank genomen, taken by the bank, something like that. So Edgar Wortman seems to be the most sophisticated thinker in thinking through the whole system of at the macro level, the national, or then in this case, European currency. And I'm really interested indeed how that might interact then with local currencies and how that could be best designed. And that there would be some give and take between the two movements who are not always integrated. You might sometimes have movements, they say like, well, we got the solution and if we implement ours, most problems will be solved, and so we don't need yours. But I'm thinking that things like public banking, local currency, then at the national level, a sovereign monetary system, they can all very well work together and amplify each other. So if you're not in contact with them, I would say get in contact with them and see what kind of conceptual interaction might happen. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, thanks. I do know him. I haven't met him personally, but I'm like he's on my list of people of local experts. And because I'm working for the social trade organization, and they are working with Ons Geld, especially to deep dive into the legal and legal aspects of the whole system. So he is sort of an advisor to us at least to me in an indirect way. But I'd love to meet him and talk more. But to also go a little bit more into what you were saying about the different types of money or coexisting, and I'm probably as Bernard Lietaer said, a big fan of the concept of the ecology of money, and that these type of systems can coexist. And I've noticed also in Amsterdam, in the southeast, there's a different version of a local currency, which is really about rewarding volunteers, the makkie. You might have heard of it. And there's also another also in the southeast, another group which also gets some finance from the government, and they have a blockchain-based system with points and with really small scale with only local entrepreneurs. And I'm always open to talk, and we're trying to keep each other up to speed. And at the same time, in the back of my mind, I do find, especially with a system like that, like in a way we could be competitors, but I really want to create the atmosphere in which that is not sort of that's not the sense that we're sharing, but there is a certain sense of so if we successfully grow this network in the New West area, and we would like to grow to the rest of town, we don't want to push out successful existing networks, but it would be great to merge them in a certain way. And that is especially in if there are like really a lot, they might start to bite each other, and because you do need that skill, and if a lot of things exist next to each other separated, then you're gonna lose effectiveness. So there is a certain balance, I think, that can be best found if everyone keeps talking to each other and being open about the mission, which is not something, as you say, something to be really selfish about in terms of this is now my project, so I just want this to succeed, and other projects can well, you can figure out what they can do. but so that's, I'm trying to stay in contact with these other initiatives, and yeah, find a way that we can work on this mission together instead of feel like we're competitors, because in the end we're not. And because I've talked to these groups, and it's very clear they have similar goals, they have similar analysis of what's wrong. They just use a different software, or they have like a slightly different functions of it. And there's discussions to be had about the details there.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I'd love to.
And good luck with your research. We'll be looking for your papers and
Yeah,
try to understand them, because they might be on a high level of abstraction, but some of us can deal with that. We'll see.
oh great.
Thanks for your wonderful presentation. That was very nice, very clear, very visual, and inspiring, just to know how much is already going on, of course. But also a little bit on the other side, like, well, how long we already know, how to do these things. And yeah, we have to go up to scale, and let it be known, though, that these alternatives are there, and that they can be implemented, and that people, it doesn't take engineers or rocket scientists to do it.
Exactly.
Or it's more about political will and education, I think, than technology. The technology seems to be there. So
yeah.
But thanks
Exactly.
again. Good luck, and was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I see Lucille still has a.
I put it up again. I don't see other people with one, so I'll take the seat. So I need to read some of your work. I haven't read it yet. Your presentation was great, and yet it raised questions for me. So I'm not sure I followed everything in terms of how the system in Amsterdam works, talking about what you're working on. You call it a payment system, and yet is it so? And so it seems to me, and you're using euro, it seems to me you're talking really about increasing the velocity of money, of euro, within your locality, which makes really good sense. And, other than the larger issue I talked about before with, you're sort of having your cake and eating it too by being part of the bigger existing money system, and yet, trying to protect it for your locality. That's a different issue. But one time when you were talking, you said, I was thinking, well, there's not really lending and borrowing going on. It's just increasing the velocity of money. And then you did talk about borrowing money, and you used the term that, well, I will create that money because I borrow it. And I'm like, well, is that the case? Or you're using money that's within the system? It's the same amount of money in the system. And so if you're borrowing it, yes, you're taking it out of the system and you're borrowing it to spend it on something within that system. And the entire system, I think the other thing maybe other people caught and I didn't, all of the system is on your phone. It's all, there's nothing physical. It's all using euro that came out of the wider euro economy and is somehow accounted for in with your cyclo system. And if you are borrowing money, it seems to me, you're not creating money, you're using money that's circulating in that system. And what you're doing is adding your creativity. You are creating value of a faster circulation of excess money in that system. And am I getting at what you're like doing?
There's a,
And I'll be quiet
there's,
and listen.
there's a few things there. Maybe I should start with saying a little bit more about how exactly we want to apply, because first of all, it's a flexible software, and it's true that the main reason or the main goal as well, in a way, is to increase local circulation of money and local velocity, because that is the main problem right now, just economic issues in this district, and we want to keep money there. So that's sort of the on the face, the first thing that I would mention to my political colleagues, like, because that's usually the most concrete, palpable result, more purchasing power, and from that spilling over social social connections, cohesion, this kind of effects. But we're trying to get money into that system in a few different ways. So either through subsidies, as in Santa Coloma, but mainly through procurement. So we want to sit together with these larger institutions that will decide, hopefully, and I haven't gotten any commitments or anything yet. So this is really a plan which is part of this bigger strategy, which hopefully in the next few months will start to make real progress. But I'm not expecting any real Amsterdam euros to be spent within this year. So it's gonna take a while, because we need to build all these relations. First, identify where is the opportunity in this area to either create new local supply to answer local demand, or these transactions that are already taking place to start with, and to house them within this local system, so that hopefully this money or this system will sort of ensure for the first time actual trickle down effects, which of course are sort of a fake Republican creation, that like this concept. And I'm very reluctant to use that term even, but that is sort of the point, to actively start to connect smaller and local entrepreneurs and businesses to larger substantial financial streams coming from governments and big institutions, and to really analyze specifically where these opportunities are. So that's the way you can push money into the system. And then about creating money, of course, that like saying it in that way is always a bit tricky, because we talk about the central banks now creating money, or the governments creating money out of thin air. But in a way, what we're doing, of course, within that system. So imagine if I or the government spends money into this system, it means, as I said, this money goes to this pot, which is locked up, and the credits are created, because it's still like a digital system. It's a fully digital system. You can access it through your phone, your computer, or whatever, but it's digital. And so what happens is, if we want that credit, that interest-free credit, you do sort of create it in this system. But because you add a positive and a negative balance, you create that, but it's the same amount. You don't create more debt than you create new money, which is why it should never affect the balance or the integrity of the system. So saying or calling that creation of money, like, in a way it is, because you're creating it within the system, and what you're doing is you have a risk assessment, and that is added to the backup, so that if this money is not paid back, if this credit is not or is defaults for whatever reason, there is a guarantee fund, so that the integrity of the system and the amount of backup versus the amount in circulation is still preserved. So hopefully that sort of gives a little bit better image of how it works. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of details here that are important and is also flexible, and that's why I'm not completely sure on a lot of these details yet, because we're really in this process now. And we're working with people such as hopefully Edgar Wortman soon, who is, I know he's in contact with Henk van Arkel, who is the director of the Social Trade Organization, to work out these specifics and to make sure that it's both compliant and it keeps its integrity in terms of the goals, and it has this potential to scale up. And that's what we're trying to work on.
Great. Yeah, thank you. It's interesting, important, good work. And you probably are familiar. I'd encourage you to read Joseph Huber's new book on the monetary turning point. It was published in German first, if you read German, but it's also in English now. And a book I find really useful. I'm not sure if, I'm curious if you've read it, and then I'll pass to somebody else. But are you familiar with Macmillan's End of Banking?
No, I'm
Is
not.
so, this is it, and
Yeah.
it's a 2014. I can put it in the chat, but I think at the macro level changes, it's pretty helpful analysis and historical of understanding how, I mean, even though they're macro economists and one's a banker, it's they do really situate our existing system in its origins, sort of in double entry bookkeeping, and they look at how we can end the creation of money out of credit. That's how they define banking, and distinguish between money being in the public sector, wholly public, and money and credit being in the private sector. And even in your talk, there were a number of points, and people debate this a lot, but there were times where you seemed to use credit and money almost synonymous. And some people do that, and some people are clear about the distinction. And I would say that as you do your dissertation work, like really trying to tease that out is important. And I would say this is a good, helpful book for that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. No, this is really valuable for me because I'm not a specialist on monetary economics. I'm not a specialist on the macroeconomics, but I'm focusing on this instrument as for a larger transition, of course. So economic systems, and this is a big part of that. And you can imagine it's tricky because there are so many different, like it's so interdisciplinary in a way. What I'm trying to do with this transition, because it touches upon all of the fundamental aspects like property, competition, monetary system. So I'm plowing my way through all the most relevant pieces of literature and information. But this sounds really good because I do realize that if I'm going to be talking about this on a larger podium as well in the Netherlands or who knows, I do need to get my facts straight about these kind of things. So so thank you.
Yeah, take your time. It's a life's work. And
young.
yet the trajectory of the broader economy is going faster than some of us can read. So anyhow, thank you very much for your work.
Thank you.
Are there any last? Oh, Alex, there you go. Alex will have the last question, and then I will close us out.
I suppose it's not so much a question as really saying thank you for getting all of your amazing ideas, your amazing work, and this huge background and rich abundance of European projects into the awareness of this group and spreading it internationally, planting the seeds all over through the awareness that you're building and the really exciting traction that you're getting locally within Amsterdam. I'm super excited and really, really thankful to get to witness you rocking this with so much expertise and eloquence. And thank you.
I should thank you, because without you, I would have been here talking. So I think we should all thank you a little bit as well.
It's networking.
Exactly. And I was, I'm also energized and inspired by a group like this and by you contacting me and encouraging me. So that's it really strengthens the whole movement, I feel.
It's collaborative, like you mentioned.
Exactly.
It's the whole culture around all of these movements, I think, is a major opportunity to move away from the current financial system has cultivated just a zeitgeist of competition and people being at each other's throats around innovation. But in reality, we get to choose to create value in a way that creates value for us and others and the whole world at the same time. And I think it's a really cool chance to model it, and you do it within your talk by talking about all of the different projects, boosting them up, boosting their awareness. at the same time as drawing their successes into a new usable tool. It's really exciting.
Nice, thank you. Yeah, and what you're talking about there is what I'm talking about in my other paper, which I didn't go into, but everyone is of course welcome to read.
I'm excited. Keep me posted.
I will.
All right.
Do you have a
Hopper,
reaction? Or-
I do see, I'll let you go. Yep.
Yeah. So how is this network came to into existence? How did we get you here today through Alex, and Alex who is connected with who?
Alex found me, I think. I don't know how.
I think Ryan
This
found
all
out.
this is all through the Donut Economics Action Lab. So we initially networked, Thomas and I, through that, and Fern also found me through that. So the bridges have been built through the Donut Economics community.
See, every concept can have its usefulness in a certain way. I like to write these type of concepts as or like serve them as waves and not get married to them, as I say. Because whether I like one paper I'm talking about circular economy, donut economy, post-capitalist, regenerative, like all of these concepts, they're just waves, and you see which one you can take to go to reach the shore. So that is a good way to view it, I think. All right, I think that's it. Maybe Ryan, last word.
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much for joining us today. And it seems as though we gained a lot from you, and hopefully we are able to share some useful resources to help you out in your work. And so I really hope that we will keep this discussion alive and know that we are a resource that you can lean into. And we would love to follow up with your work as you publish it. So please, let's keep this line of communication open. Very grateful. And I do just want to shout out our annual membership meeting is happening on July 22nd. It is exclusive to members. That'll be from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern time. So I really encourage you, if you are not already a member, to please join so you can be a part of that discussion, where we will talk all things Alliance for Just Money and share the work that we are doing now and into the future. So again, that's July 22nd. And we hope that you mark that on your calendar and become a member if you aren't already, and you all will get the invite. So thank you all for being here. And thank you again, Thomas. We really appreciate you taking this time, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. It was great to be here. Have a good weekend.